A very warm welcome. You're joining us at Hydepark, and tonight we will talk about Sri Lanka's way forward in the changing world dynamics. We've invited to our studios a Sri Lankan-born expert, of course, the Associate Professor at the Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Dr. Professor Howard Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Indeewari.
It's indeed a pleasure to have you here at our studios at Hydepark. Let's start off talking about what's happening in Sri Lanka. We've missed our growth targets, a debt trap, and there's a lot happening in Sri Lanka. But we'd like to hear from the expert. What do you think about Sri Lanka today?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure. And secondly, I can't claim to be a real expert on Sri Lanka because it's a long time since I've lived here and worked here on a daily basis, and that's when you develop an intimate knowledge. But I look at Sri Lanka through an investor's eyes. I try and invest the little money I have in a number of different assets and different countries. And when I look at different countries, I have to look at Sri Lanka because of my origins. Although I brought a little bit of money here, not a lot, I've kept it in foreign exchange because I do not think that the direction of the economy is such that I would feel confident in getting a reasonable return. Mm-hmm. So, as far as I can see, there are problems. Many developing countries have similar problems, but I don't have the confidence as an investor that Sri Lanka is on a path that will result in a remunerative return on my investments.
Are you saying that you will not invest in Sri Lanka?
Not at the moment, but somewhere in the future, if Sri Lanka does the sorts of things that I as an investor would like to see, I will certainly invest in Sri Lanka. I think Sri Lanka is actually a gold mine because it's a small economy. It has underperformed for a very, very long time. I don't think it takes that much to turn it around, and when it does, because the Sri Lankan market is so small, when foreigners come with any amount of money into the market, it drives it up very fast. We've seen it in previous times that once Sri Lanka is drawing the attention of foreigners, it moves very, very quickly. Now, I'm not short term. I'm not looking for that 100% in 1 year and then I'm leaving again. I would like to be confident that Sri Lanka is going on a growth path for 10, 20 years. I would like to invest the money and leave it.
In terms of from an investment perspective, for an investor, why wouldn't an investor come to Sri Lanka at this point? What's really going wrong here?
Well, the starting point from the analysis I have done is that Sri Lanka has underperformed in terms of economic growth. If we look at the dollar value of GDP, Sri Lanka is actually underperforming the average for all emerging markets. This contrasts with, for example, a country like Vietnam, which has overperformed. One of the reasons is that Sri Lanka is heavily dependent on two sectors. I can't even call one of these a sector, but two sources of foreign exchange earning. One is tourism, the other is private remittances. This is the remittances of those workers who are working in the Middle East. You can't build an economic strategy on that basis. You need to produce, you need to have a diversified production base, and this is not something I see at the moment in Sri Lanka. People try and give me a positive take on Sri Lanka by saying, well, we're developing our services. That's good. I don't say there's a problem with that. But again, services can only yield rapid economic growth if they're based on production. And by production, I mean particularly manufacturing sector.
You're known for your pragmatic approach. You've, in the early days too, invested in the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, in both Sri Lanka and Vietnam. Let's talk about returns, how that came about, because you made simultaneous investments in the two countries.
Not in the 1990s. In the 1990s, what happened is I was here helping to set up the Institute of Policy Studies. And at the same time, I worked with the private sector, and one of the things we created was a company called eConsult.
Right.
The advantage of eConsult is it gave me a more intimate knowledge of what was happening in the private sector. At that time, we had President Premadasa, who initiated an export-oriented manufacturing strategy. This is something that I believe would catapult Sri Lanka. I believed at the time, and the evidence showed that Sri Lanka's growth rate accelerated at a time, remember, that we had a war in the north and the east and an insurrection in the south. Yet Sri Lanka was growing faster than the average of any other emerging market. So what we saw was this translated into a rapid rise in Sri Lanka's stock market. I put some money, not a lot, because I'm not a rich person, and that grew by about 200 to 300% in dollar terms. So this was actually a golden period for Sri Lanka. After the president was assassinated in 1994, we got a change. And the change came with a change in strategy that I didn't think reflected that strategy that underpinned the previous growth period. So I disinvested my money from Sri Lanka at the time. The contrast you're talking about is more recent. In 2015, now in 2015 I disinvested money from the bond market. I had money in the bond market from the early 1990s right through till 2015, a little bit still in 2016, but I disinvested that money and I looked to replace it with another investment, an investment that I felt was remunerative, long-term. And naturally my eyes fell on Sri Lanka again because it's the land of my birth. And so I brought a little bit of money here and put it in a bank account, much more experimental than anything else. And I did the same thing for Vietnam because I have been teaching in Vietnam and I've been studying the economy there. And I saw in 2012-13, they switched from being a coffee production economy to a manufacturing-based economy. And I started to see foreigners getting very interested in Vietnam and the Vietnamese economy responding with rapid growth. And by 2015, I was convinced that I should convert all the foreign exchange I had in Vietnam into shares. And that's what I did. Again, you know, it's very small amounts of money, but it's mostly, I teach what I invest in, you know, and I can show students, look, this is my belief.
Right.
And this is what I've done. And this is the result. So we see from 2015 to the present, in dollar terms, Sri Lankan market has actually fallen by between 20 and 30%. The Vietnamese market has risen by between 20 and 30%. It depends on what you take.
Right, and let's talk about what Vietnam did different to Sri Lanka after this short commercial break. We will talk more about where Sri Lanka should be in the next 10 to 20 years, and of course in the long term after this short break at Hyde Park. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park, and we're talking to Professor Howard Nicholas, presently an associate professor at the Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Of course, Professor Howard Nicholas has made several predictions in the past, and we'd like to talk to you more on what you predict going forward. But before we go there, I'd like to speak a little about your Sri Lankan link. Born in Sri Lanka, you've done a lot in Sri Lanka. You've invested, you've been the reason why you've established think tank, and you've made a lot of changes in the Sri Lankan economy at a certain time. Let's start off about your links.
Indeewari, you've endeared yourself to me forever because I love talking about my Sri Lankan heritage, you know. But once you start me, you won't stop me, so I know we'll run out of time. Yes, I was born in Sri Lanka. Bizarrely, on my birth certificate, it says Slave Island, Colombo. So for foreigners, Slave Island, they said, were you born as a slave? What is this? And I actually grew up on an estate. My father was a planter. He was actually a planter for Ronnie DeMel, you know, the famous finance minister.
Yes.
And that's actually what brought me to Sri Lanka when I did my study in the UK and graduated. My parents encouraged me to come back to Sri Lanka because they told me, you are not British, you're Sri Lankan. No matter where we are in the world, they told me, you are always Sri Lankan and you have to go back and make a contribution. So one day when I was able to, I came back and I was in the Ministry of Finance, just actually poking around and seeing what I could see. And I'd been introduced to Dr. Lloyd Fernando, who was then the head of the National Planning Division. And I was looking on the wall and I said, oh, I know that person, that's Ronnie DeMel, you know. And Dr. Fernando said, do you know Mr. DeMel? And I said, yes, my father worked for him. And he said, hang on a minute. And he called Mr. DeMel and said, well, we have Howard Nicholas here and he says he knows you and so on. And Mr. DeMel immediately asked me to come up. And that's how everything started, because he told me, you are a Sri Lankan, you need to make a contribution. We have just the job for you. And that's how all of this actually started. It was he who made the suggestion to start the Institute of Policy Studies.
Right.
And the interesting thing he said to me at the time is he said, well, you know, we have had offers from very famous universities and very famous economists to start this, but I prefer a Sri Lankan. I prefer someone whose heart is in this country, where we can work with that person and they understand our culture and our way of thinking as well. And he said, if you are happy to do this, we will support you. And we were very fortunate. We had the support also of the Dutch government. The Dutch government provided a very large initial fund to start the Institute of Policy Studies. And the rest is history. I came here in 1987 with my family, my wife and my young child, and then we had 2 more children here. But we stayed a total of 9 years here. And I learned an awful lot in Sri Lanka. I also learned a lot of economics. I was actually taught by the business community.
This in Sri Lanka?
In Sri Lanka. This is the real world. This is your academic book, but this is the real world. they actually helped me change the way I taught economics.
Is that how you thought, how you brought in that practical aspect to your teaching?
Absolutely. And actually, I must say, Mr. Demel also did something that really changed the way I approached everything. He said, I want you to give me feedback on the economy, but I want you to understand all the poor people in this country and the fact that their lives depend on what you say and what you do. So it can't be just an academic position. You have to be very practical, and you have to believe in it. You have to believe in it because when you make the wrong decision, you have the lives of so many people on your hands. And that actually made me feel cold. Because as an academic, you're so detached, you know, you can prognosticate and say whatever you want to say, and it has no consequence.
But I think that's a good lesson for politicians too in today's context.
Well, I hope they adopt the same attitude. I'm pretty sure that most of them do, but...
You said your heart is in Sri Lanka, was in Sri Lanka back then.
No, is still.
Now, as an investor, is your heart still in Sri Lanka? You said not in, right now Sri Lanka doesn't have that investment climate that you would certainly be looking forward to as an investor to come invest in Sri Lanka, to expect the kind of returns you do.
I tell everyone the same story. My heart is in Sri Lanka, but not my wallet. And when I teach, I always teach on the basis of investment. I'm wrong many times, but then I pay the price. And I try and learn. Each time I try and learn the lesson. Why was I wrong? What was wrong with my thinking before? In this case, I've had a lot of experience. Generally, countries that are not manufacturing based are not going to give me the sort of returns that I'm looking for. And that's, as I told you before the break, this is why I'm so keen on Vietnam at the moment, because they are a manufacturing based emerging market. Sri Lanka is not. My heart is still here, and I'm wishing for the best, and I'm wishing for a change in the right direction. And who knows, I mean, maybe the politicians are already thinking in the same direction, and you know, I'll be pleasantly surprised in the near future. I would hope so.
What changes should we adopt if we are to not only you know, have you fully engaged and to participate in Sri Lanka's growth story going forward?
Well, one thing that I caution people on is you can't change economies in a drastic manner. You know, this is not to say we wholesale abandon tourism, we wholesale abandon services. But there are a number of things that one can initiate which are extremely important. And that is to give a signal to the business community that we are going to support all export-oriented manufacturers that fit in our broad strategic goals. I mean, it's not every export-oriented manufacturer, but it is those that are going to produce in the context of what Sri Lanka thinks is important at this particular stage. And to do it within the constraints, the fiscal constraints that are there at the moment. This is not a call to blow the budget, for example. I think this would be suicidal. You know, we don't want to just borrow massively and throw money at manufacturing and so on and so forth. This is a gradual change, but it's a signal. And there are lots of things one can do without actually throwing money at it. Recently, I met somebody that was trying to export organic agricultural products. Organic is very close to my heart because I eat a lot of organic vegetables and organic food. And this was bizarre because I was in something called the Good Market, is it?
Yes.
And they were there buying some fruit juices, and I was buying fruit juices, but I didn't know what I was buying. And I asked this person, do you know anything about these? And she said, well, I don't know a lot, but you know, there's this tea that is very good, and so on. And we got chatting, and I asked her, so what are you doing? She said, well, I'm giving up on garments exports, because she said that, you know, we don't seem to have very much support for this, and this seems to be a declining thing.
Government support.
I guess that's what she meant. But she said, we're looking at exporting these organic products. And I said, so do you have more hope for that? And she said, well, we're looking at it seriously, but there are all these obstacles. And I asked her to give me 3. And she came with these 3, just like that. And the first thing she said to me was so striking. She said, the problem of certification, so the authentication of the organic material, she said, is very expensive and it's very difficult to acquire. Now, that's something you can do very quickly, and it actually can be something government can help with.
Right.
I've seen it done in Vietnam. They're also doing the same thing, and they've done it so quickly. You know, so once you make a commitment, then that's something that government can do without a tremendous cost. Okay?
You speak so highly of Vietnam and what Vietnam offers to an investor and how they manage their growth. But shall we do a checklist for Sri Lanka going forward? What do we need to have in place?
I think nowadays everyone is starting to realize the old dogmas that government was bad for a development process is wrong. I think actually we've now come to learn without government, rapid economic growth is impossible. Government can facilitate it, but it can also hinder it if it does the wrong things. But in countries like Vietnam and a number of other countries, I mean, actually every East Asian country that you can name that has become successful has done it with massive government support and massive government intervention. And they've done it by enabling entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. This is the crucial thing. They've enabled. It's not that they have run industries, it's not that they have started up industries, but they have actually initiated by enabling. If you look at China, the myth is that it's all government factories and government industries. It's totally untrue. It's totally untrue. 85 to 90% of the Chinese economy is private. And they have a philosophy which is really important, and it explains why they have such rapid technological change. Their philosophy is competition. They don't allow any monopolies in any industries. Case in point is smartphones. We hear of Huawei. And everyone talks about Huawei now because of the embargo by the United States. But if you look at the smartphone industry in China, Huawei is just one player. True, it's a very big player, but there are at least 5 or 6 other very, very big players, and they fight tooth and nail to secure their share of the market. In fact, they're driving each other out of the Chinese market into the global market. That's why they get such rapid technological change. But, and that's the but, that a lot of it, the technological development, is funded by government on condition they deliver. You know, you can't just take the money and not deliver, because then they cut you off.
Right.
But it's this combination. They strategize, they provide the financing, but that's only the tip of the iceberg, the financing. It's an entire structure. For example, they make the linkages between the industry and the universities. It's very important. They provide the whole tax structure. They provide the logistical backup to enable the companies to bypass lots of the international barriers that are faced by all companies in the world. It's a wholesale commitment to their companies in a global marketplace. We think, well, we used to teach that if government is involved, you're a country that's going to fail. It's going to be a disaster. So we were all waiting for communist China to collapse. Quite the opposite. Because actually China is not communist. It's an aggressive capitalist country that does not allow political changes, from one regime to another. It has political changes, but it's not one party to another. But at a business level, it's a highly capitalist country, with a lot of entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. But support, a lot of support from the state. Now, the most interesting part of all of this is that the US and Europe have put a lot of pressure on China not to go forward with their next 25-year plan, which was planning to actually go into high-tech areas, right, which would take China well beyond the technological capabilities of the West as it stands today. China would far and away dominate the world economy. Already they're threatening to do that with their advances in 5G. Mm-hmm. But they would go so much further in so many other areas. This is again the mix of state and capitalism, aggressive competitive capitalism, the emphasis on technology change. This is something we didn't realize for a very long time until more recently. Now there are a lot of studies being done on it, is how they have encouraged all this technological change. Mm-hmm.
And when we thought China was close to the rest of the world, so much has been happening. But I'd like to talk about these three aspects that you primarily focused on when we wanted to sort of like prepare a checklist for Sri Lanka in this evolving external landscape. We'll take a short commercial break. We'd like to speak more. Of course, you did forecast a more prolonged global economic recession at some time ago. We'd like to talk about all these predictions and your forecasts for the future after a short break. Do stay with us at Hyde Park. Welcome back. This is our final segment at Hyde Park this week, talking to Dr. Howard Nicholas. As we spoke during our previous break about China's growth in the global scenario, Sri Lanka is more and more involved in this regional power play where India, China, and of course the United States, we see heavy involvement here. But from an economic perspective, whom should we be closer to? Or what should we adopt in managing these great nations?
Well, I say two things on this, Indeewari. The first I say is that paramount importance is economic and political independence. Sri Lanka is not a vassal of anybody and should never become a vassal of any big power. That's of course very difficult in this world, but it should be a goal of government to have this. The second thing is, it was my understanding that for a long time Sri Lanka was not considered interesting for the West, for India, as an economic entity. Mm-hmm. It's only when China started lending money to Sri Lanka and building Sri Lanka's infrastructure that eyebrows were raised in India and, of course, more so in the United States. And now Sri Lanka has become a football, mm-hmm, as it were. Now, from my way of thinking, there have been mistakes, because one of the things you have to do is to make sure that everyone is accorded due respect. whether it's China or United States or India, we give them all due respect, but provided they respect the independence of Sri Lanka. I think Sri Lanka is in a prime position to take advantage of this global football match, which is being played over Sri Lanka, and ask all those who are interested now to come and participate with Sri Lanka to build up this manufacturing that we've been talking about, crucially to agree to bring their technology and knowledge and share it with Sri Lanka. This is something that is often very difficult to do. China managed to do this with a lot of foreign companies because the Chinese market was the carrot. Everybody wanted to get into China and share in this market. So the Chinese government used that as a carrot and said, okay, if you want to come to our country, you have to sign these agreements where you agree to share your technology and impart skills to our people. I mentioned earlier that I have taught in China. I've been actually teaching in China since 1999. Mm-hmm. I still teach in China. One of the interesting things in the early days is I would ask all my students, where are you getting the finance to do this MBA? Because it was a very expensive MBA. And I would say about 60 to 70% said from the foreign companies that they worked for. Because the Chinese government insisted on scholarships being given to their people who are working in the middle and upper levels of the foreign companies in China. It's less so now, but this continued for at least a decade. And the same they've done with technology. In fact, that has been far more important to them because what they're trying to do is develop an independent technology base and an independent skills base. And this is what they've always wanted FDI for, not for the money. Because if you're just going after the money, then you get nothing once the foreigner leaves. But what they wanted was something, a legacy, and an important legacy on which they could build. And this is something that I believe Sri Lanka is now in a position to do with foreigners because, you know, somehow for geopolitical reasons and other reasons, they think being involved in Sri Lanka is important.
Do you think so far, you know, all these agreements and deals and our involvement with these foreign superpowers, that Sri Lanka may at some point put our sovereignty at stake?
I don't know enough about the deals. I'm going to look at it in greater detail, but there's always this danger. There is always a danger because they are in this geopolitical battle. And obviously, they would want to make sure that they have a bigger stranglehold over Sri Lanka than the other superpower. I think there's always that danger, but I do think that Sri Lanka is in a position, because it's not just the US and China facing off, but it's also India. So there are three powers that Sri Lanka, it's not to play them off against each other, because that's even more dangerous, but rather it is to get them to appreciate that the best solution for all of them is if Sri Lanka is neutral, and each of them can make a contribution and strengthen Sri Lanka and enhance its neutrality. And I think this is what Sri Lanka has to do, and look at agreements in that context. I mean, I don't know the agreements. I've been told about a few of these.
But from what you've heard, why do you think Sri Lanka has been unable to dictate terms? If Sri Lanka is so important in this region, geographically, in the region, and if all these countries want a piece of Sri Lanka, want to be a part, why has it been difficult for Sri Lanka to make these terms clear?
Well, simplistically, of course I'm not an expert in these matters, simplistically I would say it's the lack of economic power. It makes Sri Lanka vulnerable. it makes Sri Lanka dependent on loans and access to monies from, let's say, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the aid group. So that makes their bargaining position very weak. I just give a comparative position of Singapore. When Singapore first began its development process with Lee Kuan Yew, they were very weak. They were very weak, but they navigated through troubled waters to become much more resilient by developing a strong economy. You know, in the end, that's your ultimate insurance policy. You have to develop your economy and develop an economic power base. An economic power base that makes you less and less dependent on having to seek foreign monies to supplement your reserves or finance your budget deficits. And this is something that Sri Lanka has to aspire to in the medium term. Otherwise, they're always vulnerable to one group or another that will come in and say, yes, don't worry, we will take care of all your debts and we will provide you with the finance, but nobody provides a free lunch. Nobody.
Speaking of debt, Sri Lanka is plunged in a debt trap, but you see this as the least of Sri Lanka's worries.
Well, superficially, Sri Lanka's debt is not that significant in terms of developing country debt and global debt. So Sri Lanka's debt is about 60 to 65% of GDP. So I've been lauding Vietnam to you, and Vietnam is considered to have also relatively low international debt to GDP. And they have about 69 to 70%. Okay, so significantly more than Sri Lanka.
Right.
The difference between the two countries is your ability to service that debt and to pay it off. Now, actually, Sri Lanka has been reducing its foreign debt quite significantly since 2009 as a percentage of GDP. For me, this is a very important ratio as a percentage of GDP, because GDP is your income, and your income is the basis for you repaying debt. So Sri Lanka has actually successfully reduced that, but the question why people raise this issue is Sri Lanka earning enough foreign exchange, and going forward, will it be able to earn enough foreign exchange to actually service this debt, even though it's smaller than the debt contracted by other developing countries? This is where the real concern is, because if Sri Lanka is just relying on tourism and migrant remittances, and as we have now seen, tourism gets affected by political problems in the country, then you immediately get into difficulty servicing your debt. Okay, this is obvious. Once you become more diversified in your economy, once you have more sources of foreign exchange earnings, you're more resilient. And then your ability to even borrow more is much greater, and to service that is much greater. And of course, you know, a lot of countries have leveraged their economies, borrowing more, investing more, and growing much faster, because foreigners see them as creditworthy. And this is the position that Sri Lanka should try and get into. At the moment, foreigners worry that even the little debt that Sri Lanka has cannot be serviced. I think that's the problem.
Talking about the global economy and how Sri Lanka is intertwined with the rest of the world, you did deliver a fabulous guest speech at the Kadragama Center on the current state and future direction of the global and Sri Lankan economies. What do you forecast for Sri Lanka?
So I always start with the global, because Sri Lanka, I repeat it, is not an economic island. It's a geographic island, but it's not an economic island, meaning that it is so interconnected with the world economy that where the world economy goes, Sri Lanka goes, over the short run. So if there is a global recession coming, and many people are forecasting it, and the data is showing increasingly that we're headed south, as it were, then Sri Lanka will suffer. There's absolutely no chance of Sri Lanka escaping that. How badly it is affected, we don't know, but all the telltale signs are there now. Many developing countries are suffering weakness in their exchange rates, Sri Lanka too. Many developing countries are already having reserves, foreign exchange reserves being depleted, Sri Lanka too. So we can already see the effects are there. This is likely to get worse in the next 18 months to 2 years. There's only one small chance that there's a stay of execution, and that is if a trade deal is reached between the US and China that comes with a commitment to resuscitate the world economy by both the countries running huge budget deficits, bigger than they have at the moment. This actually, in my view, will create even more problems for the future. It's only a stay of execution. It is not a fresh beginning. So I think whether it's this year, next year, or we can even postpone it a couple of years, there has to be a major correction in the world economy. And Sri Lanka will also suffer in that situation. But there's a silver lining. And that is what we see is in all major recessions, companies from the advanced countries relocate production to the developing countries, especially those countries that have the infrastructure and the policies that are amenable to that relocation. That's why Vietnam is primed to benefit. We already see it because foreigners are gushing into Vietnam, but this is also a potential opportunity for Sri Lanka. There is a second factor which shouldn't be understated, and that is that a lot of countries, companies that were invested in China are also seeking to relocate. Chinese companies themselves are seeking to relocate. They're doing it worldwide. Sri Lanka could be one of their destinations if we get it right.
And this will also help Sri Lanka look at an outward economy, as you say.
Exactly, exactly. And if Sri Lanka, I mean, that's why I say that all is not lost. I'm one of those eternal optimists that I think that it's never too late. If you do the right thing, and Sri Lanka has tremendous potential, it has the educated labor force, it has the entrepreneurial spirit, etc. And I think foreigners know this. You know, it's just putting a few of the pieces together and starting.
You spoke about enabling entrepreneurs for healthy competition and also technology changes funded by government. These were certain winning changes and policies brought about in larger economies. But before we wrap up for this week, I'd like to ask you what immediate changes we need to make in the short term in order to look at that long-term change, positive change that you're talking about.
Well, really, it is to sit a number of the entrepreneurs down together with the bureaucrats and ask them, what are the obstacles you face as export-oriented producers? Now, as I say, okay, manufacturing is one of those areas and the key area, but it's not the only one. Remember, we mentioned organic agriculture, because that's much more high value added than ordinary agriculture. Ordinary agricultural exports, I'm not so enthusiastic about, but organic, yes, because the elites of the West will buy these goods. I think you have to ask the entrepreneurs, what are the barriers you're facing? Most of them will always say finance. And this has historically been the way the East Asians have promoted all their export-oriented activity. In the old days, it was development banking. In a period of the 1990s, Sri Lanka's success, in the period 89 to 94 that I spoke of, the garments factories were funded by the two development banks that Sri Lanka had. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, they were privatized. Today, there is a move away from development banking because they're being targeted under WTO rules. You can't directly subsidize industries in that way. What has happened in a number of countries is they're using other avenues. One is municipal and city financing of activities. One way or the other, however the government does it, government has to absorb some of the financial risk in order to promote these entrepreneurs, because you're trying to support the small and medium scale companies. Don't forget, in Japan, companies like Toyota and Sony and all of them were actually small companies at the beginning before Japanese Development Bank started to work with them. Samsung of Korea was a small company. The Development Bank helped them grow by absorbing the risk. Sri Lankan entrepreneurs are a miracle. They do all of this without that support, you know, and I find that an absolute miracle. Imagine what they could do with the support, you know, where the government absorbs some of the risk.
I hope all these changes that you envisage will actually not only have your heart in Sri Lanka, but also let us win your money back to Sri Lanka.
It'll be very small, but let's get some other foreign money coming in.
Certainly. I really hope these changes that you look forward to will be the changing story for Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, Howard, for your time here at our studios. We're indeed honored to have you.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Hope to see you again soon.
We look forward to hosting you here at Hyde Park once again.
Thank you.
We had with us Professor Howard Nicholas joining us at Hyde Park this week to talk about Sri Lanka's challenges and the way forward for the Sri Lankan economy. We will see you again next week at the same time at Hyde Park.